So when we look at the severity of inflammation, it's based on two factors: how much, the amount or the volume you consume, and the frequency. How often do you consume it? So it's kind of like, well, how much fuel you put on a fire and how often do you put that fuel and how much of that creates more fire, right? So let's just give an example. If someone comes in and we do their testing and we test 64 different foods, right? We have a plant panel. We also have a regular panel that has animal proteins because we still want people to eat the lesser of as they're transitioning to. Remember, we're not talking about perfection. We're talking about realistically. So realistically, we want to look at, well, still some people might eat animal protein. So we still want to look at what is the lessers of those animal proteins that's not triggering even a higher amount of inflammation on top of the normal inflammation that animal protein will do. But say someone comes back with an IgE, an immediate and a delayed for wheat. Okay, we're not talking about gluten issue, just a wheat issue. Okay, maybe they have an immediate for dairy. Again, they don't know. They love eating cheese and milk and ice cream, stuff like that. They have a little bit of delayed of tomato. They have an immediate for avocado and a little bit of delayed for chicken. And then there'll be a scoring that, like how much, 1 to 5, 1 to 6, for example. Now, none of these are life-threatening. So a patient like this can say, what do they have? Well, I have chronic inflammation. I have colitis. I have IBS, gas or bloating, diarrhea, constipation. I have some depression. I have high blood pressure is difficult to control. I have high cholesterol. I have a little bit of overweightness with a little bit of insulin resistance or blood sugar problems, and my joints hurt. Kind of the standard person walking around in America today. And, chicken tacos, delicious, right? For most people say in America, like, hey, this is great. So, we have a little bit of wheat tortilla. I couldn't find a corn tortilla picture. That's why I put wheat here, by the way. Okay, so usually it's corn. So a wheat tortilla, if you had a restaurant, some kind of chain restaurant, right? Because they sell wheat now more. But unfortunately, okay, so they're giving you wheat tortilla. You have some cheese, tomatoes, the salsa, which has more tomatoes, and the guac, which is the avocado here, and chicken. So this combination is stacking, right? So like if the person just had, say, a little bit of tomatoes in a salad, or just a little bit of guacamole with chips, they might be right here on the right-hand side. It's just the normal level of inflammation. They haven't crossed that levy point. Now we put this all together, the stacking of all these ingredients right here in the middle, and boom, they've crossed this levy point, and now they're having the reaction. Now, the problem is, say someone's going to say, well, gosh, this is delicious. I like this. Now I have 3 of them, even more so, right? Because now we're stacking, and then we're stacking that stack. That triggers this bam explosion, and people will have a flare. That's why people go, gosh, I had an IBS bout, or had a joint bout, or had a migraine headache. It just comes out of nowhere. I did everything the same last week, and I didn't have a headache, and then now I have a headache or some kind of pain or dysfunction now. It's just the stacking effect. Now, this is just the food aspect of the amount and the frequency that you're eating. We're not talking about other things that lower this or change this threshold in terms of sleep, in terms of stress, in terms of other things in the environment that also contribute to inflammation. So just the food itself is the largest contributing factor, but it gets worse based on how much other things that are also stacking outside of foods, which I'm going to cover right now. So other things that can stack for inflammation is obesity, right? So like 70% of the United States is now overweight, right? And I think 13% is morbidly obese now, right? With the BMI over 40. That'll be in one of my previous lectures. You can go see that on the internet. So obesity now increases all these things. Have higher blood pressure, you have higher diabetes, you have higher heart disease, you have increased risk of clotting and a decreased immune system functioning, just with having a little bit of weight. That's too much. And we all are privy to this. I mean, we're not immune from the last pandemic of us, not exercising as much or having to, eat, have food delivered and not socializing. So people kind of tended to feed themselves, the stress. They were drinking more, eating more, smoking more, doing these things because we were stuck indoors. But these all trigger inflammatory responses. Okay, so all these kidney problems, heart disease, lung problems is all exacerbated. Even people who have COVID, again, the reason why Americans died more than any other country is because we carry more of these risk factors along with this. So when the virus came, it just had a higher rate of causing further damage to our bodies that our body was already fighting. So if you have already fire in multiple parts of the house, there's fire in the basement, there's a little fire in the kitchen, fire in the bedroom, and then this virus came in and just went running through the whole house with a flame, then the whole house was burning down. And unfortunately, that's why still going forward, 30% of Americans who are asymptomatic meaning they didn't have to go to the hospital, who got COVID, have what they call long hauler syndrome. And these are chronic inflammatory responses that are now, we have to go back and repair some of these things. And that's going to be chronic fatigue, and cognition and memory problems are the two largest things that 30% of Americans now who have had COVID will have continuing going forward. Now, the stacking effect of chemicals. So when we think of chemicals, and there's a lot of people on the panels in this conference that are experts in this area, and they just will talk just about, GMOs and glyphosates and all. But remember, the stacking effect is of all of this. So aside of say the chicken tacos that I mentioned before, then we have to talk about, well, what about what was sprayed on those foods? And what was sprayed in the yard that the person's walking around barefooted and spraying with pesticides and herbicides? What about all the preservatives now that are being in packaged foods and things that, have this long shelf life, and then we're buying it and it's coming from all sorts of different countries because, that's where they grow it, and then they can preserve it. But what is the safety of these chemicals, and how long and how much should be using? That's why we're trying to go for more whole foods and more fresh foods like your great grandparents or your grandparents used to consume. Preservatives, xenoestrogens, these are all the different kind of hormonal estrogens that come from plastics. MTBE, these are all things actually we can test, and we test in our clinic. MTBE is a gasoline additive. It is found in a majority of our patients now. You don't have to be living in Texas near some fracking field. We now know that there's so much waste that's being dumped that we don't know in our ground table or in our water, that we can actually start seeing this now. And that's been classified as a potential carcinogen by the EPA. And more recently, if anybody's been paying attention to the news, this last week, a study came out on microplastics. Two of them, in fact. Microplastics have been found. So microplastics are the tiny little particles that come from plastic that we ingest from fish. We have a huge amount of, so those people are like, oh, I eat Mediterranean, I eat my wild caught salmon, I'm eating my cod and my, all my other fatty fishes that I'm supposed to eat, is full of having microplastic. And for those people who drink from bottled water, right? All these packages, they're drinking sodas and waters and everything is coming in from plastic. And unfortunately, in the studies also, infants are now, because all the infant bottles, everything that they're feeding with the baby is coming from plastic. So there's 50% more microplastic found in the stool samples of patients that have IBS, irritable bowel, diarrhea, and constipation. What does this mean? Is that these microplastics are also causing inflammation. These also carry xenoestrogens. So when we look at these higher rates of estrogen positive breast cancers and other types of things, that these are things that we're getting every day that we don't even know that we need to clean up our environment. Now, this week, the study showed that 80% of healthy people that volunteered for the study, this is brand new, it's something that we didn't know that could occur, they actually found the microplastic in their blood. Now, that should just, like, everybody should just be dropping right now, like their jaw should be falling down, because the microplastic in the blood, we have no idea. And what they did right now in the animal studies now, because this was just in healthy patients, what they've been looking at in the animals, because they've been feeding the animals the same thing as the people, is they're finding out that the microplastics is now being kind of stored, particularly like in lung tissue right now, at least in the studies. They're also thinking it's going to be stored in liver and other things, and actually affecting the red blood cells' oxygen uptake. Right? So these are all putting chronic stress on the body, creating chronic inflammation in the people, putting higher risk of cancers, because this is now being lodged. It's not that we're just pooping it out. It's having an effect of absorption. It's have a effect on our blood, which is, traveling and through our body, giving nutrients. So now we're understanding, when we look at 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women in their lifetime getting cancer, these are some of the things aside of the diet that we all are expected to clean up. Again, alcohol, tobacco, our key e-cigs, please do not smoke or vape. And then finally, one of the things that's interesting is something called copper. Now, we're finding this excess copper when we do the testing in our patients. There used to be copper deficiency 20 years ago. And, copper was added to supplements. There would be like, more zinc, 15 milligrams of zinc, 20 milligrams of zinc, for example. And then there was a 0.5 milligram to 1 milligram of copper, because they want to have a little bit of copper in the diet. Nowadays, what we do is we see the testing, and we don't know why, but people's copper is off the chart. And that just tells us that there is some kind of industry that I don't know about. Maybe some of the other panel scientists and people who are more into the environment will know about this. but there's some kind of industry that's using a high amount of copper that they're dumping into food supply or water supply. Because when we see patients from all around the country, doesn't matter whether they work in an office, whether they work out in the field, whether they're a homemaker or they're a corporate executive, we start seeing this high copper level. Now, why that's important? Because high copper level is related to decreased immune system and putting the patients in a higher pro-inflammatory state, right? And so we look at what they call a zinc copper ratio, and that's why having zinc foods, importantly, and also zinc supplementation if the patient is low in their zinc when we test them, is super important, because we have to shift this. Now, one of the funny things that I see companies selling now, like hydrosols of copper, there's all these supplement companies that are selling copper for all these nutritional benefits, but they're not testing patient copper levels. So if most people are coming back already toxic or high, why would I want to give a supplement that would make that worse? So you have to be careful of, just because something is natural or something is like someone's selling you some information, you have to understand where that information, or how does that apply to you, not just to some general marketing campaign. Now, chemicals. So let's go further on the chemicals. So before I was talking about like some of the environment, like glyphosate and all those things, right? Like glyphosate, which is, let me go back here. This right here in my book, and there's other doctors that will talk about it in the panel and these lectures this week. But this is really my understanding and my assumption, which has now been proven by other documents and research articles and studies. When people have a gluten sensitivity, it's not the gluten itself, is the glyphosate that binds to gluten and gliadin in wheat. I wrote about this in my book because that was the data coming out of Europe in multiple studies. It was shown that from the introduction of this glyphosate, there's about 22 statistically significant increase in diseases based on this addition of the glyphosate into the food supply. And so we don't see it in countries that don't have that problem. We do see it in countries that do, and America is the country that has the biggest use of that ingredient. So when people look at, oh, I can't eat gluten, or I have to go, grain free, it's not the grains problem. It's what we've done to the grain. Remember, Jesus was eating bread and breaking bread. I mean, every culture for millennia on down has some kind of bread or grain-like food. And a lot of people are trying to push this anti-grain. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to go back to what our ancestors or what our grandparents or we did like 40 years ago, before we started really using a lot of these chemicals that are disrupting our microbiome and disrupting our health. Again, my microbiome lecture that was given, go back and listen to that. I'll talk about how it affects the gut lining and leaky gut and inflammation and absorption and all sorts of other aspects. Now, going back to the stacking effects of chemicals, so right now there's about 84,000 chemicals that are being used on a daily basis in products. Now, the sad thing is, out of which only 1% has ever been tested for safety. Right? So again, jaw should be dropping right now. If there was an audience, I could see his jaw drop if there was there. Women on average, they use 12 products a day on their body. I'm just like that: shampoo, conditioner, deodorants, perfumes, makeup, and men use 6 on average, right? So women are getting exposed to 168 different chemicals a day, and men about 85 different chemicals a day, which on par, most likely, have not been tested for any kind of safety. So remember, skin is your largest organ. So yes, we talked about eating food, try to get cleaner food, try to be more plant-based. But when a lot of people are like, oh, I'm plant-based, or I'm eating, more organic, and then they just go to the regular store and they're just buying all sorts of stuff, their deodorants and their perfumes and their makeup and their shampoos and their hair gels and body sprays. They've now shown that even some of these men's body sprays actually decrease their testosterone production. So you see all these commercials where the young man gets like in an elevator, they spray themselves and they're trying to attract women, but actually physiologically he's actually doing the opposite. He's actually lower their testosterone levels. So it's very funny. We have to be careful of this marketing. We didn't have to use all these chemicals, but remember, most of these chemicals that are in these products are what they call inert ingredients. And I write about this in my book. Inert ingredients meaning that they're not the ingredient that is used to actually have any form and function. They're just a filler. Okay. So when you look at a shampoo, for example, there might be 50 ingredients, but most of those ingredients are not to lather and to make your hair all clean and shiny. These are inert ingredients that are bought from chemical companies and they get a tax credit for the swap. So these companies will get a tax credit. And I wrote about this in my book. You can read about it further. But there's big companies like say DuPont and all these other big companies that that they make chemicals, and we need to we have to have unfortunately there's going to be always chemicals, because when we make something there's going to be process of making other byproducts. There's no way that we can be away from it, but we actually make too much of it, right? We're not recycling. We're using a lot of things that are just like throwaway one container use products. So in that production there's byproduct. Now that byproduct, instead of throwing it away, which costs companies money, what they do is they resell that as an inert ingredient, and another company will buy it and get a tax credit for buying the other company's waste, and they put it to fill products. So when you look at, in my book, we'll talk about, if for women who use lipstick, like how many pounds of lipstick over your lifetime have you consumed just putting it on your lips? Then when you look at, okay, well, it has a little bit of lead, or it has a little bit of mercury, it has a little bit of cadmium, or these other heavy metals that are coming in, how much does that now pertain to having another contributory risk factor of inflammation and potential risk of having higher cancers? On top of the diet, on top of the stress, on top of everything else, these are things that inadvertently everyday people are using. And we have to look at, like I mentioned before, a little bit of everything. So it doesn't mean you go home right now and throw out everything. I just tell my patients, really realistically, the next time your bottle runs out, buy something cleaner and greener. The next time your lipstick runs out, buy something cleaner and greener. You do that slowly. Otherwise, it can be very expensive, and not everybody's on a budget now. And I'm really conscious of budget for my patients. We live in New Mexico. We're a very poor state. So I'm very understanding like that money is tight for everyone. So we want to look at small changes that have profound benefits. We're not going to be a celebrity and go, oh, well, I just have everything, and here's my website, and blah, blah, I can buy all these expensive products. No, it's not like that. We look at what can the average person who's going to go to Walmart today, or Target today, or any big box store, or buy something on Amazon, what can they do to make their life better and lower their inflammation? So all these things here, again, remember, try to go for cleaner and greener. Now, the stacking effect of chemicals. So with our patients, one of the things that we do is we actually test and we see, are they exposed to chemicals? Is their body getting rid of stored chemicals? Now, some people will come back and, you can see here there's lead and mercury and arsenic and cadmium all the way down to uranium, right? And this person right here has a little bit of aluminum, a little bit of cadmium, a little bit of nickel. Now, the thing is that these things are neurotoxins. These cause inflammation. They suppress the immune system. Now, it doesn't mean that this person will have cancer, but can they have a little bit of higher risk of cognitive problems like dementia? Absolutely. Can they have other inflammatory issues with their joints? Absolutely. And the thing is that we don't challenge patients on the testing, meaning there's a lot of what I consider malpractice in which people will take a chelating agent. You'll see clinics doing this all the time. They challenge the person to take what they call an oral chelating agent. Then they have the patient urinate. They got to draw the heavy metals out, and they go, oh, you have high heavy metals, and then they got to sell you chelation. That's inappropriate. What we want to do is just measure, like, from your just normal urination, is your body excreting something that's high? And if it's higher than normal, that the government says this is the normal range, then it's considered a toxicity. Now, not every toxicity is going to be life-threatening, but it's just one of those other systemic factors of triggering inflammation and immune system dysfunction. And we can test it. Like in my state, we have a lot of patients that come back high with uranium. Why? Because we have uranium coming in our tap water at a high level. And other people, I saw the other day, someone had rubidium really high. Someone had cadmium super high the other day. Someone has lead and mercury. Mercury is one of the most common toxins. Number one cause of mercury toxicity is not from fillings that people will always want to be thinking about. It's actually from fish, right? From the ocean. My book will cover that. But what's the number two cause of mercury toxicity in patients? Chicken. Why is that? Because 99% of chicken is grown in a feedlot. And what do they feed the chicken? Fish meal. So that mercury is bioconcentrating from the fish byproduct now into the chicken. And then people go to the fast food restaurant where there's a chicken and a pickle and a bun. They stand in this double drive-through. And in our state, we have all these restaurants like that. And people in our state, since we're landlocked, don't eat much fish because we don't have the ocean. We're not here like, in Boston or like San Francisco where they have like some kind of fish. We have very, not really fresh seafood, obviously, because we live in the desert. So a lot of people eat chicken. They come to my office, they're super high in mercury and say, I don't eat fish. I go, but your chicken does. So again, cleaning up the food that's bioconcentrating, my book will cover that in detail as well. Stacking effective chemicals goes further back. Yesterday, we had this discussion on water in the panel. And I just recommend everybody go to Environmental Working Group, ewg.org, type in water database or look up the water database icon, and then type your zip code in, and it will tell you your water report. And this is ours in Albuquerque. Just to give you an example, you can see like we have 585 times more arsenic than we should. And we have all these like, haloacetic acids that are cancer causing and radiums and uraniums. This is just tap water. Now, this is going through municipal. So, it doesn't have E. coli. It doesn't have bacteria. They're not going to get a diarrheal infection. It's been sterilized for that. But what they're not filtering out is all the other chemicals that are being spilled that you dump back into your toilet. This is what this test doesn't tell us is also all the pharmaceutical drugs. My book will cover that. Which city has the highest pharmaceutical drugs of which drug, depending on where you live. So if you live in Houston, you're going to have a lot more chemotherapies due to the mega complex of MD Anderson, UT, University of Texas, and Baylor, all these huge cancer hospitals. Every time someone gets chemotherapy, they urinate it. That chemotherapy goes back into municipal, comes right back being filtered out. It filters out the bacteria, so it's safe to drink. You won't get sick from a bacterial infection, but we can't do that with the chemicals. Highest antidepressants in Seattle, highest amount of Xanax in New York City, highest amount of hormones in Las Vegas, obviously. So when we test, when we look at the water, then we want to look at, well, what can the patient do? Do they need what kind of filter? Sometimes all they need is just a simple carbon filter that goes on the back of their fridge, something super cheap, or, one of those things you get in the pitchers. You can get those brands, but then it will also tell us if those things do not filter them out, like it doesn't take out a uranium, then they might have to do like a reverse osmosis and then add some trace minerals back, because you want your water to be clean, because we're cooking with it, we're drinking with it all day long. That can have chemicals that are causing another aspect of inflammation in your body. And remember, we're trying to drink more and more. We're trying to hydrate, right, every day. Like drink at least 6 glasses of water, or try to get more hydrated, because most of us kind of chronically are dehydrated, particularly as we get older. We're not drinking enough, or people who super exercise and there's still a little bit of dehydration, So the thing is, we don't want to be having the water that is actually having also chemicals. So having some kind of filtered water, but avoiding the plastic aspect. Don't buy bottled water. Try to get a filter. It comes out much, much cheaper. And we spoke about that yesterday on the panel. So if those people want to go back and hear that discussion, definitely go back and listen to that.